To Christmas special episode at the Coffee Conversation Show, powered by the Emerging India Forum, TIF, and a tech partner, Prime Infotech Solution. Theme is Valuation, Verdicts, and Vision, the expert witness behind global arbitration. We have with us our esteemed guest speaker, James Searby, affiliate partner at Osborne Partners, director at Sapere Research Group, whose expertise bridges the worlds of finance, law, and global arbitration. With over 2 decades of experience testifying in complex disputes spanning continents, James has become one of the most respected voices in valuation, damages, and financial analysis. From leading FTI Consulting's international arbitration practices in the Americas and Asia Pacific to mentoring future experts, his journey blends intellectual rigor with professional integrity. Today, we delve into the mind of a man who's seen how numbers can shape narratives and how truth, when measured precisely, can change outcomes. And we also come to know James as a person. So, welcome, James, to today's special Christmas episode.
Thank you, Amir.
Yeah, so let me explain you. There'll be 3 rounds. James, another surprise, professional journey, personal journey, and a surprise rapid fire round where you're on the hot seat and your gift, Legal Air 101.
Thank you.
So let's begin the first round.
It is a challenge of the age, adapting AI to the practice.
Yeah. So Frenam Lion Amir Virani, host at Coffee Corner, legal tech evangelist at Prime Infotech Solution, author of 15 books. So my first question for your professional journey round, James. How was the journey shaped up and what were the key defining moments you had?
So I grew up in Australia, but I guess the first key defining moment to me was in about 1986 when, I'd studied law and computer science at Melbourne University, and I hated law and I hated computer science. And I was lucky enough to get the opportunity to go to Oxford in the UK, where I studied modern history and economics. And so that was really, a defining moment in my life. And then I guess there are several other, what the English call sliding doors moments. A sliding doors moment is one where, you see somebody on the platform and either you let the doors close and you never see them again, or you walk through the doors and maybe a new chapter in your life begins. And so about 5 years later, I had the opportunity either to take a job and go back to Australia or take a job in the UK. And I decided to stay in the UK. I've not lived in Australia again since I was 18. And that was obviously a key decision. Somehow I chose not to go home. A third key moment came about 11 years later. So I walked into the office of a guy called Chris Osborne. It was about 10:30 in the morning. He offered me a job about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And 25 years later, I'm still working with Chris here and there. And that's how I got into the expert witness world. And if there's a fourth one, I suppose it was the opportunity to go to Singapore. So in 2010, I went out and looked at Singapore, looked at Hong Kong, and decided to move to Singapore. And that, was the first opportunity I had to establish my own independent practice and testify on my own. And I guess that was another, key moment in life.
So let's build up a conversation, James. Valuation often blends art and science. How do you find the balance between analytical precision and interpretative judgment?
So I think I'm definitely on the analytical precision side of things. I think you have to be as an expert. You have to be able to, say what your opinion is and to support it with sufficient evidence that it is persuasive. So I never want to say anything that's not clearly supported by evidence, and I prefer technical rigor over loose imprecision. But I think within that, it's important to devote the most effort to the things that matter. For example, a lot of quantum experts like me, argue a lot about discount rates and cost of capital and this kind of thing. But there's no point in arguing much about discount rates if they don't really matter to the result. So, in those circumstances when issues are not important, but, are technically within the ambit of my expertise, I try to find a position that the other side can agree to, and then to focus on the issues that drive the differences in the dispute. So that's the analytical side of things, I guess. But you also need, and this is the art side, is to craft a plausible narrative. So ultimately, people like stories, and if you want your analysis to have impact, then it has to integrate into a framework, I guess, that about how the world really works, and therefore why your analysis is meaningful and ideally preferable to that of the guy on the other side of the room. So the narrative side is the art. It's not just about, well, here's my number. It's about, well, this is why my number's correct. It's plausible. It fits with the way the world works. It fits with the facts of the dispute. And that's the art side of the job.
Wow. So, James, how do you maintain objectivity and independence in environments where advocacy pressure can be intense?
So, I think as an expert, one of the main things that you're selling is objectivity and independence. It's not just technical skill or the ability to appear in the witness box and answer questions credibly on your feet. Objectivity and independence are arguably the key thing that separates an independent expert like me from somebody who's paid to speak a particular opinion. I mean, anybody could do that. And it's why, even though they may, companies or clients may have staff members who could talk to a particular issue, perhaps with more authority than me because they work in the business and they deal with these things every day. The reason why somebody like me is retained is because of the independence and objectivity, and that's why that's why I have a job. Otherwise, they'd just put forward the manager who's responsible for that plant or that area or whatever. But that person would have less credibility because they're not independent, because they work for their employer, and their employer is the claimant or the respondent in the dispute. So the most important thing about independence and objectivity is maintaining it. So you need to be critical of your own work. You need to ensure that it doesn't become advocacy. You need to look at the full chain of causation, in a dispute, in your reports and in your arguments, and if there are gaps, then, don't gloss over them or ignore them, because you'll be found out later. So you have to, you can acknowledge them. You can simply say, look, I don't know this. It could be A, it could be B, it could be somewhere in between. And if it's A, well, this, and if it's B, then something else, or something in between. So that's one way of dealing with it. Another way of dealing with it is to use deeper research or statistical inference or some other technique to try and get you across the gap that you have. Or the last refuge, or the last solution, I call it the last refuge of the scoundrel, is to go back to counsel and say, look, I can get this far, but I can't get the full way that you need me to, because I can't prove this last link in the chain. And then you go back to counsel and you say, well, ultimately, either I can take an instruction or you can allow me to constrain my opinion. And, that's your last choice. But you should never allow that gap to be filled by just mere supposition. I think that's key to maintain your independence, Because if you go into the witness box and you've got that link in your chain that's missing, then under pressure it'll be exposed, and it will appear that you've ignored the full chain of causation in order to present an opinion that's favorable. And then I think the rest of it is simply about character and mindset. So you have the mindset of being independent of the party that appointed you, not just in theory, but in fact. Then the pressure is easier to resist. So that doesn't mean that you're not good to work with. Being independent doesn't mean being aloof, doesn't mean being difficult, but it is one of the things that you're selling, and you need to bear it in mind. So just to give an example, I remember a recent case. I was talking with a client and their counsel, and they said, well, in your report you can say this in response to some point or other. And I said to them, look, I don't know whether that's true. I know it's your legal case, and I know that it's what your witnesses say, but I wasn't there, and so I don't know if what you're telling me is true or not. I understand that it's true, but I don't know that it's true. And they were a bit taken aback by that, I felt. I think they felt that I was calling them a liar or something, but in fact, I was just stating a fact. There are things that you know because they're within your expertise. There are things that you know because, you've been witness to them or they're part of your experience. And then there are things that you understand to be true, So, I understand that, so-and-so happened, but I don't know that it happened because it wasn't there. And you need to keep that in mind, I think, because it helps to keep your independence, keeps you aware of your limitations. And that's key. And then the last thing, I think, is to keep in mind that your duty is to the court or tribunal. And a lot of what we do, we will work for a year, for 2 years, for 3 years on a particular dispute. And then, right at the end, on the final day of the hearing, we'll meet the people to whom we've owed a duty of care in our reports and in our work for the last, 2 or 3 years. And you need to bear in mind that one day you're going to meet those people and you're going to be sitting in the same room as them. And if you haven't followed that duty faithfully, then, it will show, and they will have formed an opinion of you in advance. So, that I think that's how you do it. I mean, at the limit, you can always, if you're under threat, if your independence and objectivity are under threat, you can resign an engagement. But in my experience, it's very rare that happens. And nearly always, these days, the client and counsel know where the boundaries lie. And if on the odd occasion they overstep them, then you say, well, that's where the boundary is, and then everything can be fine. Everything can be negotiated. That's fine.
Wow.
That was a very long answer.
No, fine. Okay. So, James, you've transitioned from leading large consulting practices at FTI, Sapere, and Osborne Partners. What motivated that shift, and how has the experience been?
So I left FTI in about 2019, so about 6 years ago. And my motivation, I mean, simply was a better life. That's no disrespect to FTI, but if you're working for a large company like that, or any large professional services firm, then you spend a certain amount of your time doing your work as what you're employed to do, your client work, and then you spend a lot of time just dealing with the organization. Whether it's preparing budgets or doing training or doing internal presentations or whatever it is, and you spend a lot of your time doing that. And what I found was that as time went by, what I found I really enjoyed and what I loved was the client work, and I didn't enjoy the internal side of it and the administrative side of it so much. And by choosing to become an independent expert and to work with boutiques, I was hoping to do more of the the work that I loved and less of the work that I didn't love. And I think that's how it's worked out. So that was the motivation, and it's been probably the best time of my professional career.
Wow. So, James, having worked across regions from Asia Pacific to UK, Europe, Australia, how do cultural and jurisdictional nuances shape approaches to valuation and damages?
So it isn't so much that they shape approaches to valuation and damages. I mean, there are principles that are universal about finance, but cultural nuances are I think key in the world of dispute resolution generally. It's a very human business, dispute resolution, and so you have to be sensitive to your audience throughout. The client, counsel, the tribunal, and if you have, let's say you have a tribunal, I'm going to be a bit pejorative, but you have, some members come from a Western background and some members come from an Eastern background. Then you need to be careful in how you make your points, because some members of the tribunal may be looking for greater conviction and forthrightness, and some of them may be looking for more reasoned consensus. And you need to be careful in how you make your points to ensure that you reach the full spectrum of the audience that you have. I think also you may need to exercise that sensitivity even earlier in the dispute. So I'm thinking of one particular case I was involved in that settled. There was a post-acquisition dispute, and a Japanese company had bought a company in a different jurisdiction. And they bought this company, and once they'd acquired it, they discovered it was nowhere near as good as promised. And so, we were retained by the lawyers assisting them to give an opinion on how much worse it was than what they could have reasonably expected. And we came to an opinion. I forget what it was, maybe 400 or 500 million of the currency of the company in question, the country in question. And on the steps of the courtroom, the Japanese settled, and they settled for about half that. And we thought that they had an absolutely bankable claim for this amount, but they wouldn't testify. They didn't want to go into court and be cross-examined in a foreign language and testify. And if I'd known that in advance, that they didn't want to testify, then maybe I wouldn't have gone for a 500 million answer. I might have gone for a lower number, but one that you could get there without needing them to testify, without their evidence, and then they would have got a better result than the one they actually got, that they needed to settle for at the last minute. And I don't know that answer was available, but maybe if I'd thought more about their cultural background, then I might have given it some consideration. But whatever you do, I think you can't fall into the trap of cultural stereotyping. You can't assume that because somebody is Singaporean, then they're like this, or because they're French, then they're like that. So you need to be sensitive not only to the cultural environment you're in, but the spectrum of culture, if you like, but also where on the spectrum your client, your counsel, your arbitrator is. You can't just make assumptions.
Wow. So, James, you have testified as an expert witness in over 50 high-profile dispute cases. How do you prepare for cases where billions of dollars and reputations are on the line?
So I'm going to answer that in four parts, I think. I think the first part is that you have to actually believe that what you've written is true. You can't believe that it's convenient or helps the client, or that it's good enough, or that it won't be found out. the first thing is your reports have to express what you actually think is true. And if they don't, then later on, you'll be found out. So you need to be, when you're sitting in the witness box, you need to be absolutely comfortable that what you've written a year ago, 18 months ago, 2 years ago, is true and remains true today. And that doesn't mean that your work is perfect. I often find when I'm reading a report before I give evidence that, I wish I'd phrased something differently or I'd added something in. But if you're mindful that you need to testify to it, then knowing that you genuinely think it's true, really matters. The second thing I think is when you're writing your reports, you need to stand back and think about the bigger picture. So, if I put forward a figure of $1 billion as opposed to $500 million, assuming that I can get to either, right? Depending on what I assume, then how's the other side going to respond to that, and where's the case going to go? Is there a chance of settlement? Which, if the parties are going to keep doing business with each other after the dispute's over, there has to be some chance of settlement. And so if there is a chance of settlement, is my evidence going to make it easier or harder? And then talk about that with counsel. So, you need not to just put forward the maximalist case. You need to be sure that what you're putting forward fits the legal strategy. And although your duty is to the tribunal, at the same time, we are in the business of dispute resolution. We're not in the business of dispute prolongation or dispute, maximal intensity. And if there is an opportunity for settlement, then one should think about that. The other thing to think about is whether your evidence helps the tribunal. So, in my experience, you sometimes come across expert evidence that is written because the expert thinks that, it supports their client's case, or, it's academically excellent. But, when they get to the hearing, they discover that the tribunal is not really interested in what they've written. And that's because their report doesn't address the issues on which the dispute turns and in which, the tribunal is likely to be interested. So always think about, when you're writing a report, what do the tribunal need to know, and help them to become informed about those issues. A full picture might not be entirely helpful to your client, and you don't have to share a full picture in your report. I mean, you follow the instructions that you have. But if you're aware of the bigger picture and you're aware of what the tribunal is likely to be interested in, and then you'll know where the rocks and reefs are, and you can navigate those in the hearing, with fluency and honesty. I think there's a third step. I did say there were four, which is prior to the hearing, you have to know the documents. Obviously you're not going to know all the legal documents and sources in detail, but knowing what the factual documents are is absolutely key. I often find that there's useful nuggets in the factual record that I didn't know about because they weren't put to me when I was preparing the report, and that can be very helpful. Or knowing, the opposite, that there are unhelpful documents, also that you need to know about, you need to be able to deal with on the stand. And given the pressures of case preparation, you can't be sure that, you've been given every document that's relevant. So knowing the documents, I think, is absolutely key, because you understand the full context. And when they take you to, document C632, you know what's in document C632, and you're ready to talk about it. It doesn't come as a surprise.
Wow.
And then finally, in the hearing, listen to the question and answer it as economically as possible. Don't answer the question, don't argue with the question because it's the wrong question. Don't answer a different question. If the question, goes to something that's unhelpful, concede the point. Don't argue about something with counsel for 5 minutes and then concede the point, because you just look bad. if you've got something that if they've got you, they've got you, and you simply admit it. Likewise, you have to be fair. I mean, if counsel, wants to make their case by reference to your evidence, well, you have to let them. They're entitled to make their case any way they want to, and it doesn't affect your evidence either way. But most importantly, bear in mind why you're there. You're there to help the court or the tribunal, and you do that by explaining and, if necessary, sometimes defending your evidence. You're not there to fix your client's case. You're not there to argue with the other side. You're not there to criticize the other expert. You're simply there to talk about your evidence and what you've said. And if there are times when you'd like to say, well, yes, but, then you can say that, and you can ask the tribunal if they'd like a fuller explanation or whether they'd like to leave it until redirect. But there's no need to, say yes, but, and then rabbit on for, 3 minutes of the tribunal's time. It's better to simply say, well, yes, but I think there's a fuller answer, and then put it to the tribunal, and they'll either ask you to give it there and then, or you can give it on redirect. So if you establish a relationship with the tribunal who you're actually trying to help, then you'll find the whole thing goes easier, and there's no need to be defensive or argumentative. You're there asking questions, it's about your report, and that's it.
So with rapid technological shifts in finance, data analytics, and now AI, how is the role of expert witness evolving today? That is my first part. And second part is, how are these technologies impacting the work?
So I think clearly AI is the defining technology of our age, and particularly acutely for what used to be called white collar work, and that includes professional services. So the comments that I'm going to make are based on my own work in international arbitration. In some jurisdictions, like New South Wales, the use of AI in the preparation of expert reports is forbidden. And I'd like to make it clear that, if I'm in New South Wales, I don't use AI, but elsewhere I do use it, and we have at Osborne Partners we have a private enterprise edition that doesn't share with the model whatever documents we feed in, and so my comments are based on the experience of that. So I think the first comment I'd make about AI at the moment is that just at the moment it's not very good. If you need to check everything it tells you. You can't trust anything it says. Everything has to be checked, and the overall time savings are minimal. But at the same time, you have to assume also that situation is not going to continue. I went to a panel at London Arbitration Week a couple of weeks ago, and Professor Richard Susskind was talking. I don't know if you're familiar with him. And he was saying, I'm going to give you the basic summary, that with the amount of money and effort that's going into AI, you have to assume that within 5 years, say, it's going to become reliable. And although there's a question mark about whether LLMs can ever really replicate human intelligence, you have to assume that if you ask an LLM a question in 5 years' time, you're not going to need to check the answer. So that's where I think we are. And looking at the future, I think there's going to be sort of 3 phases, So the first phase is going to be that experts use AI more and more, and there's going to be a sort of arms race in which, all the questions that we didn't have time for in the past are going to get investigated, and reports are going to get longer, and there's going to be more side issues, and it's going to get more intricate. And tribunals are going to need to use AI just to read the 250-page tomes that experts produce for them all the time. But the human dimension is still going to be there. It's still going to be human experts, human tribunal, human counsel, and nothing much will change. The second phase, I think, is one in which the technology becomes more reliable, and at that point, I think reports will have a much more significant machine-driven component to them. So all the boilerplate stuff, all the background, all the factual summaries, all the cross-referencing, maybe the skeleton argument, will start to come from AI. But experts will be interacting with the AI and crafting it and directing it in order to make an appealing narrative alongside the evidence. And hearings will still be live and people will be involved and so on. But beyond that, I really don't know. There is going to be some kind of third phase, hopefully after I've ceased to do this for a living, when machines take over significant parts of it, of the whole dispute resolution process. And I'm not saying that it's all going to become automated arguments between computers, but it may be that for a lot of things, you won't need an expert witness anymore because the computer will give you a neutral, independent, unvarnished opinion about the issue in question. And that there'll be less demand for expert witnesses, I think, at some point in the future. I don't think it's all doom and gloom. There's a lot of runway between now and then. And compared to if you look at the expert witness business 50 years ago, people wrote their reports by hand, and then they were typed out in the typing pool, sometimes on with carbon paper to create copies and so on. And the word processor and the spreadsheet changed the business a lot and meant that you could answer difficult problems and do difficult analysis and do longer and more complex reports and so on. And I think AI is going to draw that era to a close and take us on to a new one. But I think there's quite a lot of runway before we're all made redundant. And I think it's going to be how we use AI as experts to enhance our abilities is going to be interesting.
Wow. So let's go maybe down the lane, James. Can you share a case or instance where your financial analysis directly influenced the arbitration outcome, which is merits of the case?
So there was a case a few years ago I'm thinking of. And it involved the hotel casino. And the claimants were a group of people who had a management contract and they were appointed. And then a few months in, the management contract was terminated and the hotel went a different way. And they had a contract for, I forget, call it 5 years. And they claimed for damages for their loss. Breaches of hotel management agreements are, a story as old as the hills. I must have done 6 of them or so in my time. And the other side, put forward a case that claimed that, the contract would have been renewed and it would have gone on for 20 years, and therefore they were owed, I forget, maybe $700, $800 million, including interest and everything else. And they had this very optimistic counterfactual. And I put forward the alternative view. The respondent did have a case that they'd ever breached the agreement at all, but to be honest, it didn't seem that was a very likely thing. It did seem like they'd breached the agreement. And my response was to try and bring things back down to earth. So to assume that, the casino would not have taken off like a rocket ship if these people had been in charge, but, it would have performed about as well as it actually did. and that the term of the original agreement, 5 years, was appropriate, and so on. And it was simply trying to bring things back down to earth and talk about things in a sensible way. And the tribunal agreed. And I forget what I think I said, well, if the tribunal thinks this, then the answer's 55 million plus interest, and if it thinks that, then it's 80 million plus interest. And they thought that, and so they went for 80 million plus interest. And the opinion was accepted in its entirety. But a lot of what I do is like that. It's not about technical wizardry. It's about constructing a compelling narrative that persuades a tribunal that it's something that they can buy into. A former colleague of mine at FTI described what we do for a living as competitive storytelling. And I think there's a lot of truth in that, which expert has the better story, which story more naturally fits the facts of the case or the way the world works, and therefore, why one expert story is better than the other. That's how you win, if winning is what experts do.
So, James, you have contributed academically through teaching and oral work. What do you think is missing in how we currently train future arbitration experts?
I think and I don't know whether it can be taught. It's just a matter of experience. But when you're learning the craft, there's a lot of focus on technical excellence and being right from a technical point of view, and being academically sound and robust and so on. But what you miss through the training is the human dimension. The human dimension matters more, I think, in arbitration than it does in courtrooms. Courtrooms are quite impersonal and formal and rules-based and strict. And arbitration is more informal, and you're dealing with very senior legal figures on the tribunal who, and you need to appeal to them on a human dimension. Ultimately you're dealing with people, and you can be stone cold the most brilliant expert technically, but if the tribunal doesn't feel like it warms to you, then you will be less effective. I mean, they may accept your arguments, but you can be more effective if the tribunal feels that they like you personally, or at least that they don't dislike you personally. You can, and it protects you from things like aggressive cross-examination and so on. So the human dimension is something that I think that you don't learn until you actually do it. And then maybe I'm treading on thin ice perhaps, but thinking about the ethical dimension of the work. As an expert, you're not there to be argumentative. You're not there to be rude to the other expert. You're not there to be difficult in constructing a joint statement or whatever, if you have to do one of that. You're there to answer the question that you've been asked by your client to answer. And you're there to help the tribunal. And beyond that, you're there to be a decent human being. And sometimes I find that opposing experts can be more difficult, I think, to deal with than probably they should be.
Wow. So, James, looking ahead, what trends or challenges do you foresee defining the next decade of international arbitration and financial forensics?
So I think, it's AI again, isn't it? And how the entire community of arbitration professionals responds to AI, is going to be key, because, you've got several things going on. You've got clients that, have got expectations about how AI is going to make their disputes, simpler or cheaper or quicker to resolve. But it's not that easy, I think, to just say, well, let's all use a large language model and we'll get lower costs and less nonsense. I don't think that's going to happen. So there needs to be quite a lot of careful thought put in about how to use AI and how to get the benefits whilst avoiding, the pitfalls. Because, as I've said a couple of times, dispute resolution is a human activity. In the rest of the animal kingdom, disputes over food or territory or mating rights, they only get resolved one way. But people have tried to create processes for resolving disputes that necessarily involve human beings, and human beings are going to continue to be involved. I'm not sure that it's ever going to be appropriate for an AI model to sentence somebody to prison, for instance. And an AI model might be able to tell you, well, of all the other crimes of this type, here are the sentences that have been handed down, but that's different to having a computer actually sent you to prison. So for now, the main thing I think is managing expectations. For a time, clients are going to be seeing AI everywhere, except in their invoices. Costs are not going to go down significantly. They might even go up a bit because I have to pay for all these extra, AI models. But in a few years' time, you can imagine a world in which a client comes to you and says, well, I've fed in all the documents to my AI, and the AI comes back and it says that if I run this case, then I've got a 60% chance of winning $100 million. And then at that point, well, what is counsel and an expert supposed to do? And, it's going to be our job to improve that case, to put the right flesh on the bones, to present the case in an attractive way, and to adapt it to whatever the legal process is by then. And that may take a slightly different set of skills to the ones that we're used to, of starting with a blank sheet of paper and working from there. But in the long term, I can imagine a world in which AI assistance reaches the point that, where that it's driving a lot of the legal process and the expert process, with human intervention at key points. Because ultimately computers can't decide on things that are judgmental human concepts. What does party autonomy mean? What does, what constitutes appropriate legal representation? What does beyond all reasonable doubt mean? Is it 95%? Is it 99%? Is it 99.9%? And there's lots of stuff to navigate, I think, before we get to AI really replacing humans in dispute resolution.
Wow. So my last question for your professional journey round, James, what advice would you give to young professionals entering the world of valuation, dispute resolution?
So I think the first thing is go where the business is. So if I'm thinking about my own journey, I was lucky to arrive in Singapore into a completely empty landscape, pretty much. There were some accountants who gave expert opinions in court from time to time, but there was nobody who really did what I did. And I remember being pulled into the Ministry of Economic Development one day, and they said, "You're an economic consultant." I said, "Yes." "And you do expert witness work?" I said, "Yes." And they said, "Well, tell us more about that." And about 3 hours later, they allowed me to go once I'd told them who all my competitors were. And I'm absolutely certain that they then went out to them and said, "Well, would you like to set up an office in Singapore?" But being there, early, and being on the ground in a fast-growing and developing legal environment like Singapore at the time, still is, was really, a wonderful experience and a great opportunity for me. And so my first piece of advice would be go where the business is. Even if you need to move, if you need to move to India, if you need to move to Dubai, if you need to move to Nairobi, go where the business is, because, as you're accelerating your career, you'll just get more opportunities if you're in a fast-growing place. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is that communication is a two-way street. The partners, we love to hear from the staff. We want to know that they're having a reasonable experience at work. we want to know if they've got an opinion or problem, or they think that the work could be improved in some way, or they have an idea. We do want to hear about it, and we genuinely do. And I've come across, recently performance reviews, where somebody wrote about me. They said, well, I wrote to the expert, but he didn't answer for 3 weeks. It's like, well, okay, but you asked me once, and maybe I was busy that day. And, you could have asked me a second time, or you could have got the case manager to ask me, or whatever. It's not really an excuse. But communication's a two-way street. You have agency, you have a voice, and you should be encouraged to use it. Whilst at the same time, I think being aware of when and how to use it. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the famous anonymous Gen Z person who shares way more things than partners ever want to know. So being in the right place for communication, I think, is important. And then the other thing is use AI as much as possible. Think ahead. Think to be what it's going to be doing in the future, where you're still needed to fill the gaps, what it can't do, and keep reskilling to adapt as new things emerge, new things come into demand. It's going to be hard work keeping up. But to be fair, I've had 2 careers. The first in the newspaper business, and then in 2000 I went and did an MBA because I could see exactly where the newspaper business was going to go. And so, I became an expert witness, completely different line of business, but keeping abreast of change and adapting and reskilling is going to be, I think, is important, more important in the future than ever, just because things are happening so quickly.
Wow. So let's go to the next round and understand James as a person. Tell us about your family and your formative years.
So I grew up in Australia. I had a pretty fortunate upbringing. My father was a barrister in Melbourne. He had a number of other things that he did in business, and ultimately he was chancellor of one of the universities in Australia. But he was a barrister at Queen's Counsel in Melbourne, and so I was very lucky to grow up, materially and in other ways. And obviously, I'm very grateful they gave me wonderful education opportunities.
So let's go to the next round and understand James as a person. Tell us about your family and your formative years.
So I grew up in Australia, and I had a fortunate childhood. My father was a barrister. My mother came from a family of doctors. And so my 2 brothers and I, we grew up in Melbourne. And it was a good Australian childhood in a way. So my father was a lawyer, and he was very influential on me. One of the things I remember most about him was, I said to him one day, I said, Dad, you're a barrister. Why do you never go to court? And he said, well, because I try and settle all my disputes because I think that's in my client's best interests. And so I'll only go to court if the other side doesn't agree to a reasonable settlement. And maybe that happens 5 times a year and we go to court and, generally I win because, they haven't been reasonable so far. And I said to him, what do you do if your client won't agree to a reasonable settlement? He said, well, in that case, if they won't listen to my advice, I tell them to go and get another lawyer whose advice they will listen to. And he was a well-known commercial barrister in Melbourne, and he was fortunate to be able to say that. But that was influential. And I still think to this day that most of the disputes that I come across ought to be capable of settlement, and there's some kind of failure somewhere if it goes all the way.
Wow. So James, you have lived and worked across continents and different cities. Which city has truly felt like home to you and why?
So Portugal is the 9th country I've lived in. Australia, the UK, Belgium, France, Germany, Switzerland, Singapore, and the US. And it has to be somewhere in Europe. I mean, I love London. It's a fabulous city and probably my favorite city in the world. You know, on any one day in London, there'll be, 20 things that you'd like to do, but 19 of them you can't do for practical reasons. And London, I think, felt like home for about 20 years. Probably my second favorite city is Berlin. I lived in Berlin in 1991, 92, just after the wall came down. And, I have a deep affection for Berlin and for the Berliners. I think a terrific group of people. The country I love the most prior to Portugal was probably Switzerland. If you're under 40, Switzerland's terribly boring. But when you're over 40, all those things, everything works and, it becomes terribly interesting all of a sudden. But there you go. But Portugal, I love. I think I've had a lovely time since moving here 18 months ago.
Wow. So, James, you studied modern history and economics at Oxford. I'm dividing these questions into three parts. What made you study modern history and economics? My first part. Second part is, which side of that duality do you feel defines you more today? And third part is, what are your memories from your Oxford college days?
So you asked me why I studied it. I studied it because it wasn't law and computer science. I mean, I realized that, I spent all my childhood being very numerate and numbers focused. My last year at school, all I studied was maths and chemistry and English pretty much. But I realized that I thought I'd try something different. And I'd always been interested in history, but I thought, well, I can't just study history because there's no professional use for that. So I thought I'd better study economics to kind of give myself the appearance of being a useful person later in life. And so that's how I came to study them. And and economics has been a useful intro into the world of work. A lot of what I do is about microeconomics and finance, although the finance I only learned later through the MBA and my Chartered Financial Analyst qualification. But as a person, I'm much more of a humanitarian. I'm much more of an historian. Nearly all of what I read in my spare time is history, and that's kind of the person that I am. I'm interested in why the world is the way it is, how things join up, why it was that, Bombay became British. Well, it became British because, a Portuguese princess married Charles II, sorry. And, Bombay was part of her dowry. And I never knew that until about a year ago. But the connections that there are around the world and the cultures that people have and the influences they have, are very always been interesting to me. And, when I look at what's going on around the world, there are some lessons from history that aren't very encouraging, I think. But there you are. But thinking about Oxford, it's the greatest luxury of all is that for 3 years, you are solely in the company of clever people. You never meet, you're in this bubble where you're surrounded by, intelligent people and obviously there are people that you like more or less within that group, but that whoever you speak to, you owe them a duty of respect, and you'll probably get that back as well. And that was very rewarding. The other thing is that I rowed a lot when I was at Oxford. Rowing is in boats and oars and things, and I love that. And a lot of the memories from that stick with me too.
So, James, when you're not immersed in data or disputes, what does a perfect weekend look like for you?
So I love cooking. So food can be a big part of it. I mean, if you look at yesterday or Sunday, when I was in Portugal, got up in the morning, watched the last of the meteor shower. It's a very dark sky here, so you can see, the night sky beautifully. Went and picked some mandarins from the orchard, baked some bread, went and got some olive oil from the local farm, went to the farmer's market, bought some food, took it home, cooked it, To me, that's a very relaxing weekend. But I do like traveling, and other weekends that I've enjoyed. We travel from here into Spain, say, and you can go to Salamanca, for instance, fabulous place, lovely city, bit off the beaten track, but you can drive there, spend a weekend, and you have a new experience of a different culture, and those sort of short weekends away. I love those as well.
So, what's a book or author that stayed with you over the years?
I'm going to pick two. One of which is a bit depressing. There's a book about the Battle of Stalingrad by a man called Anthony Beevor, which I think is probably the best piece of military history I've ever read. I read it in 2 days. It's a quite thick book, but I mean, it was unputdownable. But to me, that's a book that stays with me because, if you want to know what's the worst thing that human beings could ever do to each other, it's the Battle of Stalingrad. And whatever we do in this world, we should try and avoid that ever happening again. I mean, of course, there are lots of other terrible things in the Second World War, the Holocaust and the deaths of millions of innocent people. But just as a piece of military history, I mean, you never want conflict to become that intense, ever. And I fear that the current generation of young people and to some extent politicians just don't remember that enough. And one needs to be careful. So that's a book that stays with me just because the images are seared in my brain. But there was a book that I read when I was young, and it's by a guy called William Dalrymple, who's done a lot of Indian history. He's done a lot of history he worked as a journalist in India, and he's written a lot about the subcontinent, also about Pakistan, about Afghanistan. But his first book was a book called In Xanadu, which was this crazy adventure that he had when he was about 19 or 20, and he was a student at Cambridge. And he started off, he wanted to replicate the voyage of Marco Polo. And he went to Antioch and he got a vial of sacred oil, and he transported it all the way to the court of Kublai Khan. And the book is called In Xanadu, and it's this crazy journey of a student all the way from what is now Lebanon to China. And it resonates with another travel book I once read, called A Time of Gifts by Patrick Leigh Fermor, who at a similar sort of age set out from London to Constantinople in the 1930s, or Istanbul. I think he called it Constantinople in the book. I remember reading Dalrymple's book and thinking that I'd already wasted my youth because I'd not done something like that. But it's a fabulous book and very funny.
Wow. Since we're celebrating Christmas at the Coffee Gun Show, what message would you like to give to our viewers out there?
Well, peace and goodwill, I think, are the things that make the world go round at all times of year. And I wish that to everybody at this festive season, whether you celebrate Christmas or not.
Wow. So my last question is a reflective one. What legacy would you like to leave behind?
I think the legacy you leave behind is from the young people that you interact with. So whether that's in the professional workplace, or whether it's in the family, or whether it's out and about in the world, to the extent that you can impart what you know to help them in their careers, to help them avoid the mistakes that you made, to give them, the values that help them succeed in life. I think that's the legacy that I would hope for, that I hope everyone would hope for.
Wow. So let's put you in the hot seat, the rapid fire round. Numbers or narratives?
Numbers on
Or narratives? Which one you will select?
numbers on the record.
Oh. Valuation or cross-examination?
Valuation or cross-examination. You mean how many have I done?
No. This is a rapid fire round where there will be option given. You can select one, but quick and fast and witty.
Okay.
Valuation or cross-examination?
Valuation.
The Economist or Financial Times?
Oh, the FT, definitely.
Your favorite color?
Blue.
Your dream travel place?
Japan.
Your favorite comfort food during long work days?
I love spaghetti carbonara. And it's very quick.
One word your colleague would use to describe your leadership style.
Collaborative.
Best piece of advice received?
That's a difficult one. I would say that it is that you can't teach judgment or common sense.
Wow. Your favorite color?
Blue.
Last one. Coffee or something else to help you recharge and unwind?
Well, to recharge is coffee.
You are the
To
coffee
unwind,
show.
I do like it, but coffee.
At the coffee corner show. So you did well, and here's a book, your Christmas gift. So, as a conversation with James draws to a close, one truth stands out. Precision isn't just about numbers, it's about perspective. From the halls of Oxford to arbitration chambers around the world, James has shown that the real measure of expertise lies in integrity, independence, and intellectual curiosity. His journey reminds us that while valuations may quantify loss or gain, it's insight that truly determines value. So, like that, there are 800 coffee speakers who have shared their professional, personal journeys, insights. Subscribe, implement those changes in your life, and see the changes. And we meet with another speaker and continue conversation or a cup of coffee. So, take care. Thank you.
Thank you, man.